Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Annalise Riles. I'm Executive Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And thank you for joining us once again for another episode of our webinar series focusing on global dimensions of the COVID-19 crisis. So one of the topics that has been most requested from all of you is to think more about media and communication in this crisis and information and disinformation surrounding the science, the politics, and much more. And so we all know that in this crisis, there has been a great deal of misinformation. And one of the questions that is on my mind is, how is this different from other forms of disinformation? What's new about this particular crisis? What are the implications of it? What can we do to combat it? And so to address all of these questions and more, we couldn't have two better leaders for our webinar today. I'm delighted to welcome, first of all, Pablo Boczkowski, who is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies here at Northwestern and co-director of the Center for the Study of Media and Society in Argentina. He's also a senior research fellow at the Weizenbaum Institute for the Networked Society in Germany. And his research examines the dynamics of digital culture from a comparative international perspective. And he's joined today, we're very happy to welcome also Dr. Claire Wardle. So Claire is an expert on social media and on user-generated content and verification. And she's the co-founder and leader of First Draft, which is the world's foremost nonprofit focused on research and practice to address misinformation and disinformation. Delighted to have you both. Thank you for being here. Welcome, and turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Annalise, for the kind introduction. Thanks to everybody who's joining us remotely. And thanks, Claire, for doing this with me. It's a great honor to be doing this together with her. Do we have the slide number 2? The next one. When Claire and I talked about doing this together, I thought, because she's truly one of the world's foremost experts in this topic from both an applied research but also an activist standpoint, I thought that we could do the following, which is, I will set up the stage somewhat briefly, taking over no more than 6 or 7 more minutes of our time, talking about 2 contextual aspects of today's topic, one being the role that long-standing trends affecting knowledge-making institutions of modernity have played in the current issues having to do with misinformation on social media and in the news media in general, and then talk about some of the research that has been going on over the past 4 to 5 years concerning misinformation in the news. So I will briefly set the stage with that, and then I will turn it over to Claire, who I'm truly delighted that she can join us from my former town of Ithaca in upstate New York, and who will share with us all the incredible work that she and First Draft have been doing all around the world, and enlighten us also with potential solutions and tools, at least, that we have to fight against misinformation. So the first issue that I would like to address somewhat briefly, and Claire, if you can move us to the next slide, has to do with the fact that I view the current conversations and the current issues having to do with misinformation on social media as part of a fairly long, decades-long trend, related to the crisis in the cultural authority of knowledge-making institutions, in particular in the global north. This is something that started, give or take, in the 70s and has been deepening and broadening ever since. It affects not just one institution of knowledge. This is not just about journalism. It affects many of them, primarily science, medicine, law, also education to a certain degree, in addition to the news. It affects not just one topic at in these institutions, but many. For instance, in the case of science, we have, fights over, evolutionary theory, creationism being, for some, a reputable alternative. We have, turned global warming, which is fairly evident from a scientific standpoint as something that it is happening, into a political fight. And when we have done that as a commons, as a society, we have debased in part the institutional credibility of science. And we see some of what's going on with anti-vaccination campaigns playing out in the same mode. So what's going on with misinformation regarding COVID-19, I think should be situated within these long-standing trends that really go at the core and at the foundations of the institutions of modernity, including the institution that gathers us, the university, which is in its current form an outgrowth of those processes, and in part is under attack, in a sense, when science is attacked, when education is attacked, and when we see the spread of misinformation during a pandemic. The second contextual trend, which is more proximate, if we can move to the next slide, Claire, please, has to do with misinformation in the news. There has always been misinformation in journalism. Both in fact and also in fiction. One needs, to go back to Citizen Kane, perhaps, to have a vivid example of what could be misinformation in the news-making process. But there is a sense in the past 4 to 5 years that was fairly minor or smaller in the periphery of journalism, and the news ecosystem has moved a little bit more to the center. So there is a sense that there is a fairly significant increase in the volume and recirculation of content that is not truthful. That in part builds again upon prior conditions, having to do in no small case with serious levels of, or high levels of distrust in traditional mainstream media. There is significant global variation. For that, there are countries, for instance, Japan or Finland, where those levels of distrust are fairly low. There are other countries, like my home country of Argentina, or recently the US, where those levels of distrust are high and rising. But even in the case of the countries with fairly low levels of distrust, like in Japan, it has been on the rise. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism out of the University of Oxford puts out a wonderful digital news report every year that, among other things, measures levels of trust in the news, and it shows that distrust has increased in Japan from 18 to 19, from 6% to 11%. So there is a tide towards distrusting the mainstream media that provides the seed and the foundation for the rise of misinformation. But it should be noted, in particular in the context of the wonderful work that the Buffett Institute does, that there is significant global variation. And that's one reason to have, it's so wonderful to have Claire here, because she's done work all over the globe, and she will talk about that in a minute. Now, shortly after the 2016 Brexit vote, the US presidential election, and also the referendum in Colombia, as the three catalyzing events, there started to be a significant growth in research on misinformation in the news. At first, the first wave of that research focused on trying to characterize really how much of that exists and the composition in the information ecosystem, and somewhat implicitly assume that a rise in the supply of misinformation meant directly a rise of deleterious effects for the citizenry, in particular for the polity. Now, over the past, I would say, 12 to 18 months, we have seen more and more studies challenging that assumption and moving into trying to understand what really are the effects, the direct effects, say, in voting behavior or turnout, etc., or indirect effects in terms of quality of democratic life, having to do with exposure to misinformation. So just as a brief segue into Claire's presentation, Claire, if you can move us to the next one. Together with colleagues in the Center for the Study of Media and Society in Argentina that Annelies mentioned, and at the University of Pennsylvania, and in partnership with Claire and First Draft News, and in the interest of full disclosure, funded by WhatsApp. My colleagues and I conducted a study of misinformation in the context of the 2019 presidential elections in Argentina. And one thing that we wanted to do to try to understand the mechanism that lead to different outcomes in the reception of misinformation was to try to contextualize misinformation having to do with politics with misinformation having to do with other types of content, in particular scientific and medical information. So in a series of experimental studies that we did online, what we found, for instance, is that in Argentina, at least, and the headline from this article quotes Biocchi's famous dictum that, users of political information are not fools. What we found is that WhatsApp users in Argentina, WhatsApp is a messaging platform, but for many people in the global south in particular is akin to a social media platform, which is why I think it's relevant in the context of today's conversation. When exposed to content that was truthful and content that was not, and in a randomized fashion, people who were exposed to content that was untruthful were assigned much lower levels of credibility, number one, and were also much less willing to share that content, which tells us that the increase in the volume of misinformation does not necessarily translate directly into effects for the public or for the audience. And so a lot of the research now has been trying to understand under what conditions and depending on what type of content we see negative outcomes and under what types of conditions and for which kinds of contents we do not. And with this broad introduction, I will turn it to my esteemed and wonderful co-panelists. Claire, it's all yours.
Claire, you need to unmute.
Did you?
You are.
I think now you can hear me.
Yes, although your video is off now.
Claire, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. I think you remuted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Yes.
Okay. So I was just saying, thank you very much for having me. Apologies for the technical problems. As everybody knows, we're all using different technologies and I'm normally a consumer. But anyway, thank you for having me. It's great to be able to talk to different audiences. I actually am an academic by training. I have a PhD from the Adverse School for Communication. And an academic, felt slightly frustrated that the work that I wanted to do wasn't necessarily reaching the audiences I wanted to reach. So I left academia, but I still, every single day, am grateful for my PhD training. And in many ways, could not be doing the work that I'm doing if I didn't have that training. So I am the co-founder and executive director of First Draft. We are a nonprofit that is navigate the information ecosystem, because as Pablo stated, they are part of the information ecosystem. And certainly information is not completely new to newsrooms. And they have such an important role to play in the amplification of misinformation that actually, if we don't necessarily help newsrooms navigate this space, then they can unwittingly become part of that. And increasingly, they are being targeted by bad actors who amplification, then it doesn't really mean anything. So if you are a fringe conspiracy website and nobody's coming to your website, it only really matters if you can get a newsroom to report on that. And the next best way to do that is to get a politician to talk about your conspiracy, because then it's very difficult for newsrooms to say that we're not going to report on that. So we have a website full of training materials for newsrooms and journalists. That's our primary reason for being funded. But what we actually do is we do experimental projects. So part of my frustration is most with American graduates in a laboratory. That's great and an important body of work. But I wanted to see, what does this look like if we're doing experiments in the field and we can turn them around more quickly? We can evaluate those and then turn those into best practice training materials to work with newsrooms. So that's the model that we have at First Draft. And actually around the French election in the spring of 2017, and we had a number of newsrooms come to say, we're nervous about the role of misinformation in the election. Can we work together on a project? And as First Draft, as a neutral middle man, we decided to come up with a collaborative framework which said, what would it look like if newsrooms worked together on their reporting and publicly showed that they were working together on the reporting? So on the left-hand side is an example of a story that newsrooms worked on together, and you can see in those icons all of those different newsrooms put their logos on the piece to say, we have cross-checked each other's work. So cross-check was a project that we developed in 2017. A lot of the work that we do now because of this question of trust. Because when we then did our evaluation, we found that audiences said, you know what, I hate Le Monde, but actually I really trust Strasbourg 89. The fact that you guys work together means that I'm actually more trusting of the output. So we say there's a reason that newsrooms compete around quality information, but actually, why should newsrooms compete around the poor quality information? If newsrooms collaborate in those spaces to free up resources and also to position themselves with the audience as being with one single voice. Of course, there are criticisms of collusion, but when it comes to the kind of the stuff that we should all be, cleaning up the information environment, the pollution that's spreading, there does seem to be a sense that this works. So we have, as Pablo said, we've worked in France, Brazil on a project called Comprova, in Nigeria. We've also worked in the UK, Germany, Spain, the US on multiple elections now. And over the last 3.5 years, we've built up a body of evidence about what we think works and what doesn't work. And so with our Comprova evaluation, there was a recognition that in a country like Brazil that has a number of paywalls, you have paywalls on one hand and then easy access to WhatsApp on the other. And if you don't have a sense of this, it's really important to know that in countries like Brazil, where they have something called free basics, which means you can access WhatsApp and Facebook without having any data charges. So what we recognized was there was a real need in Brazil for having this kind of collaborative approach to news reporting, so that Comprova still exists today. And so we have managed to do this outside an election cycle, which has been the main driver of many of these projects. Being honest, that's what funders wanted to give money to, but Comprova has shown that there was a real model. And so thinking about typologies and terminology, that comes from my academic background. But we do a lot to help audiences and newsrooms think about the nuance. So the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and what we call malinformation, thinking about falseness and intent to do harm. So disinformation is false content. The creation and sharing of that information is done deliberately to cause harm. That is distinct from a piece of misinformation that my mum might share on Facebook. She doesn't know that it's false, and she certainly doesn't mean any harm. And if we're trying to think about interventions, we have to be very clear about those distinctions. We also think about this third one that we called malinformation, which is genuine information that the sharing of that is done to cause harm. So examples might be revenge porn. It might be the leaking of certain types of emails, moving them from private to public is done to cause harm. So all of this is to say, how can we think around the complexity of this rather than using the term fake news, which we refuse to use as an organization. We also talk about the 7 common types of information disorder. So we use the frame information disorder as a catch-all term. We talk about this spectrum from satire or parody, which actually gets weaponized. We see a number of bad actors deliberately labeling something as satire because they understand that that will mean that fact checkers won't look at them, that the platforms won't downrank them. All the way through to things like false context, which is the biggest category that we see, which is genuine content used out of context. All the way through to 100% fabricated content, the fear around deep fakes that we can talk more about. What the coronavirus infodemic has shown us is that for all the fears about AI-generated disinformation, really what's more effective is a text message that circulates on WhatsApp, a rumor from a friend in a Facebook group. That's really where we're seeing the biggest challenge right now. We all deal about what we call the trumpet of amplification. That often, if you spend time in anonymous spaces, whether that's 4chan or Discord, you see people coordinating campaigns. Their whole aim is to move that rumor up through that trumpet with the hope that the professional media will talk about it. So they move it into closed networks like a Twitter DM group or WhatsApp group that might end up then on a conspiracy community, maybe on Reddit or YouTube or Gab. It will then move on to Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. And that's often where the journalists find the content with no understanding of a coordinated campaign in order to get the journalists to cover it, either to fool the journalists or to get the journalist to run a debunk. Because if a journalist runs a debunk in an irresponsible way and repeats the rumor in the headline, provides a sensational framing of that rumor, then actually what it does is give additional oxygen to that rumor, making it very hard for people to remember what's true or false. And so there's a lot of literature around best practices for wording headlines and how to report on misinformation, which is a brand new field. You go to any journalism school, they are not teaching classes on how to report on mis or disinformation. It's a very new set of challenges for journalists. And we also talk about this concept of the tipping point. So let's take, for example, the conspiracies around 5G masts. And unfortunately, these conspiracies that say that 5G is helping to spread the virus. Now, we had been tracking this conspiracy since January, but we were monitoring it and saying, this is not the time to talk to newsrooms about it, because actually it's still very niche. In the middle of April, you had a couple of high-profile celebrities sharing it on social media, and then that tipped it into the mainstream, and we saw a lot of people talking about it. That's what we talk about, the tipping point, because if you leave it too late, it becomes very difficult to effectively debunk a rumor. So there's this magic moment that we call the tipping point. If you report on something too early, you give it a necessary oxygen. If you wait too late, it's very, very difficult to effectively debunk that piece of information. So we talk a lot with newsrooms about, we're seeing this, it's important that you know about it, we're monitoring it, but we wouldn't recommend that you report on it right now. So again, it's a very different way of thinking for newsrooms, who very much think about, well, more disinfectant is actually a good thing. You know, the more that we report on something, we can hold truth to power. But actually in this space, you have bad actors deliberately attempting to manipulate the media into reporting it, knowing that that reporting will give something legitimacy. So just to give you a little sense of the work that we're doing right now around COVID, today we do a daily briefing full of the misinformation, the conspiracies and rumors that we're seeing bubbling around the world. And this goes to mostly disinformation researchers and journalists. We have a weekly briefing, we have a new US newsletter, all of this just to keep journalists up to date with what we're seeing. We have a crisis simulation where we actually get newsrooms into a simulated environment to get them to think about, would I report on it? How would I report on it? What would an effective headline be? And we've had journalists afterwards say, oh, I thought this was going to be a joke, but I ended up sweating, I was swearing. This was really scary, but it was good because it made me realize that our newsroom is not prepared for 2020. So we ran 12 of these between January and March before the lockdown with newsrooms around the country, because local journalists are actually most vulnerable right now. So there's a lot of evidence that if bad actors, both domestic and foreign, are looking for the most vulnerable elements of the information ecosystem. And unfortunately, lots of local newsrooms have had their resources stripped away. They don't have the same levels of editorial oversight. And so if you are a bad actor and you go to the New York Times, it's very likely the New York Times will do the research and say, we're not going to run this. If you can get 5 local newsrooms to run it, you start to then have a situation where the Washington Post, ABC News, New York Times, like, well, hang on, that we're seeing a pattern here. And so there's real evidence that local newsrooms are particularly vulnerable to disinformation as we lead, particularly up into the 2020 election. Training in multiple languages. We work globally. We're hosting a number of webinars. They're all available on YouTube. But the hunger for these materials goes to show that most people don't know what to do with this information. And what we're finding is that there's now an appetite for the general public to also know much more about this. So we've recently released a 20-minute course for the general public, which is like, how do you talk to Uncle Bob? You know, the guy in the family who consistently shares conspiracies in the family WhatsApp group. Talk to Bob, how do you do that in a way that doesn't make him double down on his views? And collaboration, the strength of collaboration is having different types of journalists work together. So we have a Slack community with over 250 journalists, and we as a team, there's 18 of our editorial staff, and they're monitoring the different platforms every single day, looking for this kind of content. Then they'll write up briefings. So on the right-hand side, we've done briefings around misinformation and Dr. Fauci, the Film Your Hospital hashtag, which was when people were deliberately going into hospitals and filming them, trying to show that there were actually no COVID patients. Disinformation about face masks, hydroxychloroquine, as you can imagine, has been an ongoing briefing. So we provide this briefing, but it's made much stronger by having different journalists being like, well, actually, I'm in Michigan and this is what we're seeing in Michigan, or I'm actually from NBC and we've actually done a deep dive into this and this is what we're seeing. So I have to say, it's pretty astonishing to see journalists collaborate. when normally this, of course, is not something that's baked into the news industry. There is this recognition that actually working together can mean that the output is stronger. So finally, I just wanted to talk about some global misinformation trends that we're seeing. So of course, the challenge here is that we're trying to monitor a number of different platforms around the world. And as we'll discuss, a lot of this is actually circulating in closed messaging spaces like WhatsApp that are encrypted, that make it impossible to monitor. So there's really interesting ethical conversations about how do you monitor these closed spaces. But outlets like TikTok, unfortunately, are increasingly seeing conspiracy content. We also monitor Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter. So it's a real challenge to be able to do this in multiple languages. And we are certainly not comprehensive. We do what we can, but as ever, you're looking for experts in these different countries to give you contextual information. We use a number of different tools, particularly to understand that question of the tipping point, which is it safe to report on this, or are we actually going to give it more oxygen? Or hang on, is this something that lots of people are talking about, and therefore there is a need and desire for people to understand what's true and what's not? I want to go through 5 trends. The first one is this issue of closed messaging apps, which we've worked in places like Brazil and India, and WhatsApp has been a very clear vector of misinformation in those countries. But when I would talk to US newsrooms, they'd say, oh, nobody uses WhatsApp in America. What they mean, unfortunately, is many newsrooms with lots of white staff don't use WhatsApp, but anybody who is from a diaspora community in the US, any community of color will say, yes, we use WhatsApp because we are tired of being surveyed. And for us, it's a safe way to communicate. So WhatsApp has been in this country. So when I say it's new, they weren't previously using WhatsApp, but the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown, we saw a number of text messages being forwarded on Facebook Messenger, via SMS, on WhatsApp, a mixture of, oh, if you gargle with salt water, you'll be fine, to, the army is moving in, the National Guard, look at these pictures of trucks and tanks. So this has been a big trend for coronavirus, is that almost the US and Western Europe has caught up with the rest of the world. Secondly, imposter content is very effective. Those of you who are psychologists understand this, is that our brains are overloaded with information. And so we're desperately seeking heuristics, shortcuts that will help us judge the credibility of a piece of information. So if somebody puts on a BBC logo or a WHO logo, it does a lot to make people more reliant on that information. So we've seen a number of examples in the last 2 months of this type of imposter content. Conspiracy content is moving out of the fringes into the mainstream. So I've been monitoring this kind of content for the last 5 to 10 years in different ways, and conspiracies only really became a thing that I started to be nervous about 5 years ago. But it's only really during this coronavirus that I've seen these conspiracies move from the fringe into the mainstream. And so if you didn't see it, the last couple of weeks, we've seen this very high production video called Plandemic circulating widely on Facebook. And all of a sudden I was seeing mums and uncles and aunts, high school friends sharing it, people who previously would never have basically been sharing misinformation. So things like the 5G conspiracy, it was started in a lab, the conspiracies around the origin of the virus, now about Bill Gates, mandatory vaccinations, these are all gaining traction in really worrying ways. Misinformation and hate speech are increasingly blurring. People are taking advantage of existing racial divisions. And unfortunately, every single day in our editorial meeting, our team in India will say, oh, surprise, surprise, another really offensive message is circulating on social media against Muslims. Oh, surprise, surprise, it's happening in London. Anti-Chinese sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment, a real, not surprising to anybody, but we're seeing it at levels that we've not seen before. And 5 platforms are having a much harder time making sense of coronavirus misinformation in multiple languages, and particularly visuals. So anybody who's been studying misinformation, unfortunately, most of the research we have about it is based on text, or it's based on Twitter data because it's easy to access. But actually, platforms are really struggling to make sense of memes. Memes are some of the most compelling vehicles of disinformation because your brain is making sense of the juxtaposition between the image and the text. And often memes work because there's a nod and a wink to popular culture. And so memes are not covered, or they're not researched enough for my liking. And also platforms really struggle to make sense of memes using AI. And similarly, the Plandemic video, one of the reasons that YouTube really struggles is that video is very hard to monitor. And what we saw with the Plandemic video is when Facebook took it down for breaching their policy guidelines around the advice Judy Mikovits was giving about masks, people edited the pandemic video and took out the specific bits about masks and re-uploaded it, or people were watching it on TikTok. So the challenges for platforms are real. This is not just whack-a-mole of millions and millions of versions of the same thing. You have lots of different, slightly edited or different versions of the thing that is problematic. And I don't think that we talk enough about that. Lessons learned. Firstly, this is not a normal situation. We've never had a story where misinformation was so problematic that everybody was facing it at the same time. So around elections, we'd see the same tactics in Brazil play out in Spain, then play out in India. But we've never had a moment when everybody was struggling with the same rumors at the same time. And this jumps borders very, very quickly. But this is a reminder of a tweet. This is from January 14th, when WHO said there is no evidence of human transmission. The speed at which our understanding of this virus has changed means that when it comes to things like fact checking, or can we agree on a shared truth, there's not enough data yet in order for platforms to reliably say, oh yes, this is what we know right now. Even on something like hydroxychloroquine, it's very difficult for Twitter to say, right, we should take this down in the middle of March because there wasn't enough evidence for hydroxychloroquine. So I just want to stress too that this is not a normal moment because we don't have an agreed set of facts. And for example, the way that our thinking about masks has changed has done a great deal to, drive down trust in the WHO, in governmental and other health authorities, and that's a real issue. So finally, lessons learned. The tactics and techniques being used to manipulate the media and platforms are continuously changing. That's partly why academic research that's 2 years out of date by the time it gets published is a real problem. Secondly, most newsroom platforms do not have the capacity to do this work in real time, and therefore thinking about this wire agency model makes a lot of sense. Misinformation crosses borders quickly, but the responses do not. So those of us who are trying to push out quality information are not connected enough. Most problematic content is circulating in closed messaging spaces, and researchers and journalists focus disproportionately on texts, facts, and traditional gatekeepers, excuse my typo, rather than emotion, visuals, compelling narratives, and non-traditional gatekeepers to combat misinformation. So I threw a lot out there because I knew that there was going to be hopefully a lot of questions, but there's lots of things to discuss here.
Annalise, you need to unmute.
Oops. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, indeed, you've given us so much to talk about. Thank you both. And we have questions coming in. Please feel free to pose a question in the chat and I will ask it to our speakers. I personally have so many things that I'd like to ask you about, but maybe to start things off, I'll just have a question for each of you. So Pablo, for you, I'm going to ask an unfair question because I know you can handle it. So you and I share a series of academic interests in science studies, and you know that in science studies we have long understood truth in a fairly complex way, as produced within networks, and we have a lot of very sophisticated ways about talking about what facts are and are not. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that academic understanding of facts fits with language of disinformation, misinformation, false information, true information. In other words, is there a way of marrying all the things that I think you and I always believed in from an academic point of view, a moment at which there seems to just be a lot of falsehood out there? And how do we reconcile that sophisticated view with this current moment? And is there a way, do we need to do a mea culpa and step back from a lot of those theories, or is there a way that they can take on the current moment? And then maybe for Claire, I'll ask you, I'm really fascinated by your background as an academic who's moved outside the academy, now doing research in a different space, in an activist space, and you alluded at the end of your talk very interestingly to the temporality of academic work and the fact that it's too slow to keep up with this moment, and that you yourself wanted to do something faster. So I'd love to hear you talk more about how the academy needs to change to more effectively, if you like, engage with this cultural and political moment. That's very important, I think. All right, turn it over to both of you.
All right, should I go first and then Claire, you go second? Just following the order that Annelies presented us with. So Annelies, that is a great question. I think, STS as a field, and there are many different versions of, the history of STS and its evolution over time, but one could probably agree that it emerged at a point in time in which it tried to question, issues of power around science and expertise, right? It tried to contextualize and localize that. And in order to do that, it did show the many different ways in which local and contingent dynamics affected the production, the circulation, and the reception of knowledge. I think, and this is just a personal view, and this is, I'm not an expert on this in the sense I have not done research on this topic, I'm just a practitioner of the trade. I think over the past 20 years or so, at least 10 years, it has been increasingly appropriated by the very institutions that we have tried to undermine, in a sense. To me, one of the turning points of that was when Steve Fuller, who was at the time editor of Social Epistemology, became an expert witness in the Dover case in Pennsylvania, arguing on behalf of the creationist viewpoint. And we see more and more an appropriation of the tools and techniques and the processes and the discourse of STS by the engines of misinformation, right? And I think it's not doing a mea culpa, but understanding the power that has, and understanding that it's something that needs to be culturally deactivated. Otherwise, it will go on and on and on unchecked. So that's an initial answer. But I do think it's something for us in the social science, and in particular with an STS or a constructivist bent, to be mindful of, and not to take the reappropriation of this lightly.
Very interesting. Thank you. Claire.
And so to answer this question, because it's something I'm passionate about, I was a fellow at Harvard a couple of years ago and helped set up Harvard Misinformation Review, which is a journal that allows peer-reviewed research to be out essentially within 15 days. There's a turnaround and the peer reviewers are paid. But I think we just have to be much more aware of it, because somebody actually wrote a great question about bots. And I don't want to call out Carnegie Mellon, but they put out a piece of research last week saying that 50% of coronavirus tweets were from bots, but with no research that was linked. Nobody could peer review that. There's no evidence on the website about that. It got picked up through a press release and it got covered everywhere. And it led to Twitter having to respond and say, this isn't the case. Bots actually is a term that's really unhelpful, because increasingly as the platforms have come down harder on bots, what you see is more cyborgs, which is people who are paid to act like bots. They tweet so frequently. The traditional explanation that Oxford Internet Institute gave 2 years ago of a bot is somebody that tweets more than 50 times a day. Donald Trump sometimes tweets over 100 times a day. Be much more careful about how we use the term bot. And there are some people who are so enthusiastic that they tweet as if they look like they've been automated. So I would just say we have to be really careful, because we also can't get to a position like the preprint medical research now, which is people just publishing on Medium some analysis that they did over a weekend. It gets picked up by the media and there has been no peer review process. So we have to find quicker ways to do this kind of rigorous research that's peer reviewed, but also can help platforms and practitioners respond to the threats of today, not the threats of the 2016 election, which is what we're currently seeing research around.
Very interesting. Thank you. So on this question of bots, anything more that you'd like to share about the role of technology? I mean, Claire, you talked a lot about the strategies of real human beings in this and the way it gets picked up by newsrooms, especially perhaps local newsrooms. What about the role of technology? What do we know about that?
So certainly the platforms are a long way away from where I would like them to be, but they have become better at identifying what they call inauthentic or coordinated behavior. So I'm not as concerned about these bot networks as I think some people are. However, we do need to be aware of them. But what the problem with these platforms is they are being used by people in the way that they were designed to be used. So yes, you can automate some of these processes. It's easier to tweet more frequently or to create more pages on Facebook. But ultimately, we have to recognize that, yes, technology can do damage, but I think we've been so disproportionately focused on technology that we fail to see, well, you know what, a really grainy CCTV image on a phone looks like it's real, or a very unsophisticated edited video of Nancy Pelosi this time last year did more damage. So I think, yes, technology, but I fear that we've over-indexed and we've forgotten that the real problem here is that as humans, we're pretty weak. We've got lizard brains, and our emotional reaction to information is what's causing all these problems. And I don't think we've done enough to respond to that.
Go ahead, Pablo.
Yes, if I may add to Claire's, I want to call attention to the work of Tarleton Gillespie at Microsoft Research. He is an expert, among other things, on content moderation. He has a wonderful book that came out a couple of years ago, where he examined the human side of content moderation, and he showed that actually, there are limits to automation when it comes to the recognition of misinformation and other deleterious forms of speech. So platforms actually employ vast amounts of people who screen that content on a regular basis and who make decisions about whether to allow that content to be on the platform or not. And there are gray areas that are impossible, and we know this from our work in STS, that are impossible to fully automate, and that therefore what passes as proper knowledge or improper knowledge, not to use true or false, right, ends up being locally contingent decisions tied to structures of power. These are people, who are underpaid, working in, very bad labor conditions, usually in parts of the world where wages are much lower. And this is where we see the countering of bots cannot be fully or entirely automated. It has to do in part with social organizational responses that the platforms have to really embrace in order for this to happen. Another important source of STS type knowledge on this is the work of Mary Gray, a colleague of Tarleton's actually at Microsoft Research, who has done very good work on what she and a colleague of hers called the last mile of automation. That is really impossible to automate all of this because computing power and computing knowledge is not up to standard with fully automation. So it requires, again, the intervention of humans, right? And once those humans intervene, continuously, that work gets codified and then embedded into software, and then another set of social organizational challenges begin. So in order to have an effective counter, you need the automation, but you also need the social organizational wherewithal of the platforms and the regulatory agencies that can demand the platforms to do this kind of work.
Interesting. Great. Okay, so we have a few questions about methodologies for both of you. So kind of going back perhaps to our earlier discussion about speeding up the research and the importance of peer review. It seems that both of you are doing a lot of research online. Pablo, you alluded to this fascinating study of WhatsApp. We have a few people who'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about the methodological choices you make in that space. And one interesting question says, sometimes what seems like the spreading of untruths can be a form of lay critique. Is there an assumption when we say this is true or untrue that from the point of view of expertise that doesn't acknowledge that in different communities you spread, knowledge looks different. So how do you both, what kinds of choices do you make as you do this research and evaluating what your informants believe or don't believe, when it's true, when it's not true? Just talk about your methodology a little bit more and the choices you make.
Claire, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I'll just say that the conversations that we have as an editorial team now are almost, they remind me of my PhD days. It's all about epistemology. It's all about facts versus truth. It's all about how should we discuss this? And we certainly do not call ourselves fact-checking organization. We are very clear about how do we provide that context and how do we push for transparency. So as we've monitored the growth of conspiracy theories, the way that you discuss conspiracy theories is actually there has to be a recognition that, particularly for certain communities, so let's talk about the anti-vax conspiracies. there's always a kernel of truth to the most effective conspiracy theories. So, the role of big pharma, it's very hard to say there's absolutely no truth to that. You can't say that certain communities haven't been tested upon in ways that it's very difficult to justify, but the history remains with us today when people discuss this. So there is a need for us to think much more about this. And I think the way that the platforms themselves have hung on to the kind of independent fact-checking third-party process of like, they've got the truth, I don't think that's helped. And I think actually, if we're serious about getting through this moment, we have to have a very serious conversation about the labels that we use, how we talk to one another about how knowledge is constructed and created. And so I completely agree with you. I think we failed, and I think we failed at a really dangerous time during a global pandemic, because now we're sort of seeing what the impact is of our failures previously to talk about how knowledge was constructed and produced.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's great. I totally agree with Claire. And I think, I've always been even though I'm an ethnographer by training, I've always been a proponent of mixed methodologies. And with a problem as complex as this and a phenomenon as multifaceted as this, I think mixed methods are essential. So for instance, for the study that I briefly mentioned in the context of the Argentine election, where I was not the PI, my colleague in Argentina was the PI, I was an external consultant, but the way the study was designed was a combination of a three-way panel survey experiments before, during, and after the election, coupled with field interviews every week for almost 6 months. So the first round of the experiments were designed after several weeks of interviews, combining what we know from the literature with what we were seeing in the field. On the basis of an initial processing of the experiments, then other kinds of topics were asked in the interviews that follow, and so on and so forth. During a 6-month period, you can really get deep into mechanisms in a way that is locally contextualized, right? That's what the interviews give you, and the experiments give you to try to really zero in on what are the factors that dial up or down reception processes. I'm not saying that's the only way of mixing methods. It's one way that we found in this particular case, but I think mixed methodologies are absolutely critical with a fast-moving target and a very complex phenomenon.
Interesting. So maybe Claire, maybe if I could just ask you to say more about what you just shared with us, because a couple of the questions then now go to this, the question of what do we do? What strategies, what solutions do we have now? So your answer just now was really provocative and challenging. The idea that there's a certain grayness to things, maybe sometimes a certain complexity to things. And maybe the way we as experts have responded is to double down on the black and insist that the white is wrong or what have you, right? What do we do about that? I mean, is there a way to begin to tell more complex stories that engage the wider public, the non-expert public in those things? I mean, does your organization have a set of strategies alongside those problems you gave us, a set of strategies for how we could begin to fix this disease we seem to have spawned? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as Pablo said, 2016 was the year that the whole world woke up to this, even though a lot of parts of the world were like, yeah, welcome to the party, the US, we've been working on this for a while. And there was this disinformation industrial complex where there was event after event after event. And everybody would say, oh, surely Facebook can just tweak its algorithm. And we kind of got stuck for 2 years thinking there was a simple solution. And I think one thing this moment has taught us is that it has to be an all of society response. It has to be global. There is responsibilities on the platforms, on governments, on educators, on scientists. And I just don't think that we've recognized the complexity of this. And I think we're starting to. But I do think, somebody very on this moment said, listen, we haven't approached this as you would as a crisis communication problem, which is if you're during the wildfires in California, you would tune into the fire department chief who would say, right now the fire is here, tomorrow it might be here, here, or here. I can't tell you, but listen to me tomorrow and I will tell you what we know tomorrow. And I think with COVID, we failed to really explain what we didn't know. We were so quick to try and say, this is because people were desperate for answers. But what we're seeing is the growth of misinformation is because of the absence of an origin story of the virus, a clear treatment. I mean, it's not surprising, but I do think there is a moment right now for science to explain how science is created. I think preprints are causing a real problem. I think not enough journalists understand health and science. We've known it for a long time, but when I say our failures up until now have caused this moment, we can't just dismiss it and talk about it at conferences. How are we going to ensure that journalists know how to? How are we going to ensure that we explain to the public that you can have a set of data and results, but you need to replicate that? I mean, there's great conversations going on around open science and all the kind of, but we failed to talk to the public about it. And that failure to do so has meant that people are looking for the black and white, as opposed to saying, the world is messy and complex, that's why we love research. But I think there are real opportunities for us to do much better public communication. And it's not just the public health people. I think those of us who work in the communication discipline should be doing a better job.
Yes, if I may add to Claire, I think Claire just hit it in the nail in the head. I think that's the expression in English. It is so I think at a time in the context of weak institutions, strong institutions responses will not do. They can't say, oh, trust me because I'm a scientist and science is, holy grail. That we know from STS. A, that's not how science works. B, it won't cut it at this time. So it's a moment that calls for transparency and for showing process and saying, well, it might not be the perfect solution, but it's better than any of the alternatives. And I think that's one lesson from STS that can be derived and applied in this particular case.
And I think just very quickly, the question of a COVID vaccine is critical to this. So actually people are saying, oh my goodness, look at all these conspiracies that are anti-vax. Nobody should be taking a vaccine if corners have been cut and the process has been rushed and the process hasn't been transparent. So actually journalists should be doing a job of saying, how do we make the process of creating this vaccine transparent so that people are more likely to trust it when it comes out, as opposed to, trust me, I'm from the WHO, this vaccine is safe. There's been too many examples of vaccines have been rolled out too quickly, and that's where the conspiracies come from. So I completely agree. We've got a live case study right now that we could be working on, but I don't see necessarily that we're working on it quickly enough.
You're muted, Annalise, I think.
So let me ask one more question following up, and just to really invite you both to say more about this. What about when we put this in a transnational space? So I think Pablo, you talked, or Claire also, about the challenges of working across national barriers, across the fact that different kinds of platforms are used in different spaces, language problems, the fact that images are read differently in different cultures. What kinds of strategies can we deploy for getting a more transnational approach to this issue?
Claire, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, this is the Achilles heels of the platforms. They wanted to scale so quickly and they completely failed to get the structures and frameworks in place. So WhatsApp, for example, 1.6 billion users, only one member of staff works outside Menlo Park in India. So there is no recognition of those cultural complexities that we're talking about. And also when we go back to trust, Google, Twitter, actually, interestingly, Google is pointing everybody to the WHO, as is Facebook. Twitter points you to your local national health authority. And so understanding, do Nigerians trust the WHO or do they trust their local health ministry? Like we know this, we need nuance and complexity, but unfortunately the platforms are designed to be one size fits all. And again, one of the biggest lessons from this moment is you can't say one size fits all because that doesn't work. So we need more ethnographers.
That's perfect. I wouldn't add any to that answer in particular at the end.
Great, fantastic. Another question people have is, are there some news media that seem to spread disinformation faster than others? For instance, if NPR or the New York Times repeats something that's misinformation, does it spread more widely? And is there anything we know about that?
Again, when you study this, there's this idea of like one audience. And when you break apart, particularly a country like the US, there are so many different types of audiences. So if the New York Times repeats misinformation, what you see is people screenshotting that and sharing it in right-wing conspiracy spaces saying, look, the New York Times said this, editing things to make it look like the New York Times hasn't debunked it, but they're actually supporting it. So the challenge is that because we live in an internet networked world where people can screenshot and share, people twist information in the way that supports them. So there was a great piece of research out of NYU about the 2016 IRA memes. and the websites they were linking to was disproportionately local news websites in the US. So they would take a story about, a police brutality, and they would spin it and push it out again. It was genuine content, but it was being reframed. So the problem is, it's not just how it spreads within the target audience of that outlet, it's how it gets twisted and moved through the whole information ecosystem. And that's the real challenge for both the platforms, but communication scholars.
Yeah, Pablo.
Yeah, so I would add two things that we know from previous research. Number one, there is a spillover effect. That is, if a top outlet like The Guardian, New York Times, Fox, etc., put something out there, that's going to reach wider and faster and be recirculated wider and faster than if a smaller venue or less highly credible venue does it. It has been true for a long time, and it still is today, with one exception. And this is the second thing that we know, thanks to the amazing most recent book by Yochai Benkler. And when he and his colleagues at Harvard mapped the spread of misinformation over a long haul, what they have found is that in recent years, there seems to be a portion of the information ecosystem that has radicalized and moved off from the mainstream. So things look there quite differently from what it looks to most of the information consuming public. And so that, spillover effect does not necessarily reach in the same way in the more radicalized version. And that is where it comes back to the weakening of the institutions of modernity, because that's the same, information ecosystem that would distrust of the very foundations of the institutions that we so readily trust when we have a medical problem, when we have a legal issue, and so on and so forth. And how to reconcile that with the mainstream has become, I think, one of the most pressing challenges in the global north, but also in many other parts of the world.
Wow, interesting, fascinating. So maybe last question. We have one listener who's basically asking about structural issues. We've been mainly talking about tactics, right? But perhaps at this moment, we need structural reforms. For example, if we didn't gut our local news media economically, perhaps they wouldn't be so susceptible to change. And what do you both think about that, the balance of tactics versus structural reforms at this moment, and in particular, the defunding of local news?
Well, I'm just going to say that you can, as somebody from the UK, is that I have a very big soft spot for the BBC. They are not perfect, but it's somebody will write a PhD dissertation about countries with strong public service media and their response to COVID versus those that didn't. And to be fair, the UK is really struggling, but that's because of Boris Johnson. But anyway, but I think I really struggle to see this idea of, all speech counts, nobody thinking about regulation. I understand in this country there's a fear of that, but I think if we don't think structurally about what needs to be put in place, and certainly that when I see the local news deserts in this country, and it's been bad for 5 years, but to see right now with all the furloughs, a number of journalists in our Slack channel like, oh, I'm not here next week. I mean, you see very clearly like health journalists not working weeks at a time because they're on furlough when we need them most. So how we find that funding, and it can't just be down to the Knight Foundation. We need very serious structural responses to that.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it is a major problem, but I think it will have to be a massive overhaul of the regulatory system that will bring that to life again, because the audience is not there. It cannot be any longer supported by attention, which is how advertising operates, because the audience has for a long while abandoned local media massively, right? So there has to be a concerted effort to bring back to life that part of the ecosystem, or otherwise I don't think it will survive much longer after COVID.
Interesting. Wow. Well, this has been truly, for me, one of the most interesting, exciting, and helpful conversations that I have had the honor to listen to since this epidemic began. I just thank you both so much for your work, for its significance, for your commitment, for the smartness with which you address these issues. It's just phenomenal. Thank you. And thank you to you all, everyone, for joining us today. You can expect to receive a link to our survey where you can share your feedback, propose topics for future discussion. Our next webinar will be next Tuesday, June 2nd. We're going to host Professor Sally Numa and Dr. Shireen Vosogi, both assistant professors at Northwestern School of Education and Social Policy, for a conversation about education and inequality under COVID-19. So that should be fascinating. Thank you both again, Claire and Pablo, and to everyone, stay well and stay healthy. Thank you. Bye.